showing amazing screen.
I appreciate that. Okay. See, isn't the table nicer when you're a woman?
It is, actually.
Are we ready?
Fire away.
Okay, let's go. Welcome, everyone. Great to see you all. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Brent Orrell, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. My principal areas of focus are in workforce development, so I am vitally interested in learning from our panel today about some of the macroeconomic and systemic factors that low-wage workers are facing. I want to start out just by reading back to the Institute its own mission statement, which I think is really, really important for this conversation. The American Enterprise Institute is a public policy think tank dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. The work of our scholars and staff advances ideas rooted in our belief in democracy, free enterprise, American strength, and global leadership, solidarity with those at the periphery of our society, and a pluralistic entrepreneurial culture. Today's panel is here to focus on the question of, can businesses boost upward mobility? Now, since you're all very attentive listeners, you'll note that there's a tension in our mission statement, which is both foursquare in favor of free enterprise and entrepreneurship, while in its first sentence emphasizes the pre-existing centrality of human dignity and potential and the role that that plays in building a freer, safer world. How do we get both economic freedom and entrepreneurship and human dignity? Because there are some who would say you can have one of those things, one of those clusters of things, but not the other at the same time. Last night, one of my AEI colleagues was kind enough to forward me a tweet from a senior DC libertarian. Since he tweeted, I'll just say it was David Boaz, who, in response to the advertisement for this session, which asked how businesses can generate economic opportunity for workers, said, I love those ums. Those ums, you know you're about to be owned right after the by existing and hiring workers. That's a powerful argument that echoes luminaries like Milton Friedman, who said that the only social responsibility of businesses was to stay in business and maximize profits for shareholders. What both Friedman and Boaz are asserting is that when businesses provide work and wages, they have discharged their duty, done and dusted. All other questions are at best an unwarranted distraction and may end by interfering with the economic growth on which rising living standards depend. Now, of course, this is contested ground, and it has been for a long time. One 19th century thinker and philosopher put it this way: labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. This sounds like Karl Marx, but it is in fact Abraham Lincoln, a man who felt the pain of unjust economic relationships in his own life and was therefore outraged by the economic exploitation of slavery. Now, to be clear, I'm not comparing low-wage work in America today to slavery, which would be an offense to the memories of those who suffered under the peculiar institution, nor am I suggesting that companies who hire low-wage workers are engaging in slavery. They are not. They are entrepreneurs trying to keep businesses running in a highly competitive market so they can continue to deliver the goods and services that we all depend on. The jobs that they provide are often crucial first rungs on the ladder of economic advancement for those who lack training and skills that they need for other better paying jobs. My point, and I think this is the point of the panel, is to explore the degree to which businesses do or do not recognize the utility function inside how they manage the way that people are hired, paid, and promoted. This issue has become unavoidable in the current high demand, high turnover labor market characterized by too many jobs and too few workers. Last summer, AEI conducted a poll asking workers about what they thought about the balance between economic and non-economic factors in their work. Pay was a prime consideration, but operating in parallel, almost exactly the same numbers highlighted non-economic factors like opportunities for advancement and feeling welcomed on the job. Workers who believed that pay, opportunity, and their humanity were being recognized on the job were significantly less likely to be looking for new employment than those who did not. Lower turnover helps reduce business costs in terms of productivity and outlays for recruitment and training. This is the utility inside human-focused employment practices. Today's panel is absolutely primed for this conversation, each one a leading light in their field. Harry Holzer is the John Lafarge Jr. Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and an institute fellow at the American Institute for Research in Washington, D.C. He is the former chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor. He is also an affiliate of the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin and the Stanford Institute on Poverty and Inequality. Matt Sigelman is president of the Burning Glass Institute and chairman of EMSI Burning Glass. He's the lead author of a report we're going to be talking about today, the American Opportunity Index, a corporate scorecard of worker advancement. He has worked for McKinsey & Company and Capital One, and he's the founder of the Mainline Classical Academy, which brings classical liberal arts and rigorous math and science education for children kindergarten through 12th grade. Molly Kinder is a fellow at the Brookings Institution Metro program, where she examines the present and future of work, especially for low-wage workers, women, and workers of color. She is also a professor of practice and adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University's McCourt School. Her current research brings the voices and perspectives of workers at the front line of COVID-19 to inform policy recommendations to better compensate, protect, and support essential workers. Mike Strain is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. His research and writings span a wide range of areas, including labor markets, public finance, social policy, and macroeconomics. Dr. Strain is also the author of The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It, among many other articles and books. We're going to start with a few minutes of introduction from each of the panelists and some conversation among them before we go to Q&A from our in-person and virtual audience. For those watching remotely, the information for how to ask a question should be on your screen. And if it isn't, I'm sure that one of our tech wizards will put it up there again soon. So, Harry, over to you.
Thank you, Brent. I was saying in the green room before that it's very nice to go first because you can sort of say whatever the hell you want. You're not constrained by the expertise of people who might know better than you. So I'm gonna take advantage of that idea. I thought it's worth starting just by talking about the economics of good jobs versus bad jobs. A little bit on the theory side, a little bit on the evidence side, because I think that helps clarify how to think about this issue and maybe what role policy may or may not be able to play. So go back to Econ 1 or 100 or whatever they called it, if and when you took economics, and what you usually learned that is if a market's competitive, it has one equilibrium price and everybody is going to be at that price. In the labor market, that means there's one equilibrium wage for any given industry or an occupation. There's going to be one equilibrium wage, and most firms are going to crowd around that wage. That turns out to be completely false. Empirically, it's very easy to show that in any labor market, even a very detailed industry, even in a particular metro area, there's a wide range of wages and benefits for any occupation in that industry. Some choose to be above a market average, some choose to be below. Why is that? Well, if the market's competitive, and I'm going to leave aside like unionized workplaces where the union has enough power to force the employer to pay better wages. I'm also going to leave aside the kind of, those employers that have kind of a strong social justice bent and they choose to pay higher even if it doesn't make them better off. Think about competitive markets. And the one goal is, Brett said, is for the entrepreneur or the business to be profitable. So there's two broad ways of thinking about this. You can decide that the very best thing for your profits is to pay the absolutely lowest wages you can, really minimize labor costs at all costs. Although a different point of view is no, we want higher productivity, higher worker performance, and to get that we have to pay better. You have to pay better to attract and retain more productive employees who otherwise might go somewhere else. And there's actually, in labor economics, there's a theory called efficiency wage theory. That sometimes it's simply better for a business, they're better off if they can pay higher wages to get those productive workers. Broadly, another term you hear in this field, if there are these two broad approaches, two ways of thinking about this, some people talk about there's high road and low road companies. And the low road companies are the ones minimizing labor costs. The high road ones are trying to maximize performance, pay better. I think that's a little simplistic because it's not all of one or all the other. Firm compensation exists on many, many different dimensions, and some choose to be a little more competitive on some and less on others, but it's still a useful way to think about it. But in this world, again, it's all about productivity and the productivity of workers. It's not a social justice perspective. So to get that higher productivity, you're not just hiring really well-trained workers from the outside, you also have to invest in training and in promotion ladders to try to build up the productivity of workers. Often it requires a reorganization of the workplace to give these more productive employees more responsibility, maybe more power to exercise their productivity. And sometimes it requires an even broader business strategy. There's an influential book that came out almost a decade ago by Zeynep Ton at MIT called The Good Job Strategy, where she argued it's not enough just to train people to be more productive. The whole organization has to be different. For instance, you choose a limited product line or a limited service line instead of trying to do everything. You have a limited number of things you're offering to consumers and you do those really well. And you make sure your workers do those really well. And she has some famous case studies of this. Costco, UPS, which have been, on average, very good employers. There's some others like Southwest Airlines that maybe we're a little less confident about these days. But that's sort of the broad view. So the question is, okay, if you can go high road or low road, or why do there seem to be so few firms, at least in the US, that go high road these days? It feels, and the data suggests we've trended more towards the low end in wages. A couple different possible answers for that. One possibility is you can't do this in every sector. Maybe the sectors and the firms that do this have to charge higher prices and therefore have to attract higher income customers. People used to compare Walmart and Costco. And Costco was doing this, but they have a higher income clientele than Walmart. They can get away paying higher wages. Since Walmart has actually improved a lot in the past bunch of years, I'm not sure that story still holds. But that's one possibility. It's not possible everywhere. There's limited cases where you can really do this. Second possibility, though, is it is possible, but employers simply don't know how to do it. Don't even know it's an option. That's a story of imperfect information. And if you're an economist, imperfect information is a market failure. And a market failure means government has some possible role to play to help and encourage more employers to go that way. And there's a third possibility where employers might be vaguely aware that it's possible to do this differently, but they're not going to be better off. Maybe they can be just as well off by taking a higher road, but not going to be better off. So they're indifferent. And it's sort of like, well, if it's easier, if I know how to go low road, why would I switch? That's a market failure too, because that's what economists call a suboptimal outcome. If there's another way to do this, where the employers are just as well off, but the workers are better off, you'd rather be in that situation. And again, that might be a possible role for government to help get us there. So there's different possibilities about why so few firms take that high road. And let me say, the evidence base on all this stuff, is very limited. We don't know the answers. I mean, I think people who are actually working in the field with a lot of companies may have more case study kind of information. The hard data don't really tell us that much yet. But very quickly, if you believe that at least one of those market failures might be operative, and you think there's a public role to encourage more high road, higher wage companies, how do you get there? How do you accomplish that? You know, and broadly, there's either the carrot or the stick. The carrot is tax credits, subsidies, technical assistance. And the Biden administration is actually doing that. The Biden administration has these two initiatives, the Good Jobs Challenge at the Commerce Department, which is mostly about a human capital. Invest more in training your workers to make them more productive. Good Jobs Initiative at the Labor Department is more bring the stakeholders together and try to explore different options and things like that. But that's kind of a softer touch. The stick is more mandate a $15 minimum wage federally. And when you mandate the higher wage, employers will make sure that the workers they bring in are more productive. Now, personally, I lean a little more in the carrots direction. I would like to see a higher federal minimum wage. I'm not ready to go to 15. Mike Strain and I have talked a great deal about this, and we're more or less on the same page on that because there's an alternative. When you go to 15, it might be that employers will simply automate a lot more and eliminate a lot of these jobs. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but certainly 5, 10 years down the road. So I'm not quite ready to go there. But then I'll say one more thing, and then I'll stop here. What often happens when you have a really high minimum wage, what the evidence shows is even if it doesn't reduce employment, it causes employers to shift to a different kind of employee, a higher productivity, higher skilled employee. The employer becomes less comfortable hiring really low-skill employees who may not have the skills to merit, say, a $15 minimum wage. That can happen with firms that take the high road as well, right? Going the high road doesn't necessarily mean every person who walks in the door, you make them really productive and you invest in training them a lot. And American employers don't like to invest in employees that they don't think are really good. They want those employees to stick around, but they also want them to have good basic skills, good work readiness, and they're skeptical. So that's a possibility. We don't have good data on this, that one of the ways that a firm can go higher road is simply to raise the bar at the hiring stage. Maybe that's not a bad thing, as long as there's enough other lower wage employers out there. But it's just like, I think we should think about the costs as well as the benefits and some of the complexities if and when we want to see more firms go this route, which I think many or most of us do. So I'll stop there on the economics and look forward to hearing from my colleagues here.
Well, I'll see you on the economics and maybe raise you one. We'll see. Harry's talked a lot about productivity, and I'm going to share a lot of what we've learned about worker outcomes, but I want to stay with productivity for a second. When you think about productivity, of course, is the ratio of the value of labor input, or value of labor output to the cost of labor input. And so one way to think about the distinction between high road and low road, maybe instead of those terms, maybe to think about the difference between numerator and denominator. When we think about productivity, we tend to think a lot about the cost of labor. How do we pay people less? How do we offshore talent? How do we use process efficiencies to help people do more with fewer hours of work? We tend to think a lot less about the numerator, about the value of human endeavor. And I think a lot of the opportunities, we think about how people rise within a company. It's not just about their experience. Ultimately, what you're seeing at companies where people are rising is the value of their human capital stock is increasing. Ultimately, the productivity increases because people are stepping up to do higher value work. So just maybe a way of expressing both why we tend to get so focused on the low road, as Harry put it, but also what we can unlock when we start to focus on the value of human endeavor. So I said I would share some of what we've been learning in developing the American Opportunity Index about how people rise. And so I'll start with a little bit of a view to the genesis of this work. This work which I'm very proud to have undertaken together with HBS professor and AEI fellow Joe Fuller, and of course with the extraordinary partnership in the Schultz Family Foundation. This work grew from, I think, a broad concern that many of us share with, and Mike will talk more about this as a perception later, whether this is perception or reality, but the view that, and this comes from Chetty's work, there's been significant declines in upward mobility. So famously, someone born in the 1940s had about a 90+% chance of doing better than their parents. Some born in the 1980s had at best even odds. And so when we put against that backdrop, we spent a lot of time looking at what might be at play. We tend to think mostly about the worker. What kind of education she had. Did she get a degree or did she not? There's all the theories about grit. Does she have grit? Does she do not? All these things index around what workers do or don't do, what workers have, what they don't have. And as we've done some work, Joe and I, a couple of years ago, did some work looking at people who are starting out in so-called poverty trap jobs, looked at how people rise when they do. And one of the things that we found is it made a big difference where you worked. Likewise, together with colleagues of the Schultz Family Foundation, we looked at people who started out as opportunity youth and found that more of them than we had assumed actually were rising to people who were starting without work attachments, without education, and found that many of them, the glass was half full, so about half of them had risen to living wage jobs over a 5-year period. But that notion that you could have two workers in the same role at directly competing firms who have an entirely different prospects of moving up really stuck with us. And so we wanted to dig in to it, and we wanted to measure it. So the opportunity index is conceived as a way of creating that kind of yardstick around worker experience. So we were creating this, a lot of folks asked us, well, why don't you measure practice? Who's offering learning benefits, who's offering health benefits, who's got coaching programs? The point is not that those aren't important. Quite the opposite. We think that those kinds of things are likely profoundly important. But the problem is that we don't often know which ones actually work. And so to Harry's point before about some of the kind of information asymmetries and information imperfections in the market, part of that comes down to the fact that we actually haven't had a good set of outcomes, yardsticks, to measure progress against. And so what we did is we said, look, let's leverage new data sets that allow us to actually track real people's careers at scale. We looked at 3 million people who are working in jobs that are open to those without a college degree. There's an index out there somewhere which is measuring the progress of lawyers and software engineers and data scientists and their upward trajectories. That's fabulous and deserves to be created. But this is really focused on the people whose careers are most in the bubble. And we looked at 3 million people who are working at Fortune 250 companies 5 years back. And we looked at what happened to them over time. Who rose, who didn't, how far did they go? Did they rise by staying within the company? Did they leave in order to make trajectories? Did they leave and wind up no further along than they were when they started? And in order to do that, we wound up having to create a set of metrics. See, our goal was to measure the level of opportunities that those Fortune 250 companies were creating for their employees, but opportunity is a big word. And so we said, okay, well, how would you define opportunity? Well, it's how much access do people have to opportunity? Can you get on the ladder? How much mobility do they have? Are people able to keep climbing once they're on the ladder? And how much do they make? Very importantly, you afford enough to stay on the ladder. I mean, even those are actually very wide and amorphous concepts. Whereas as Harry put them before, hired, promoted, and paid. And so underneath of each of those, we had to create a set of measures. So for example, in terms of access to opportunity, it makes a big difference. Are companies extending opportunities to people who don't have past work experience? Are they extending opportunities more or less than their peers to people in the same role who don't have degrees? Range of metrics around mobility. How far do people rise? How fast do they rise? When they leave, do they wind up somewhere better? Do they stay around long enough for it to matter? We put all of this together, and we came up with an overall ranking that was based upon, we weighted each of those factors based upon a survey of 500 workers and what they told us mattered most to them. So wage counted most, but one of the things we heard from workers was that almost as much as wage, they valued the chance to continue to rise, essentially to be able to balance how much they're making today with how much they have an opportunity to make more over time. We put that together and we created an overall ranking, but the overall ranking lost something. And that's this. That it turns out, to Harry's point about different companies making different choices about what works for their business model, we realized that we were losing different dimensions. I'll give you an example. Say you're a company that is some of the kinds of companies we all know of as we hear all the time they're great places to work. They have a cult-like following of customers and employees. Well, if you work at one of those companies, almost inherently, there's going to be less opportunity to rise. Think about what the US workforce would look like if no one ever retired. You wouldn't be able to enjoy the same ability to climb. That doesn't mean those are bad places to work, quite the opposite. They pay people well, they respect people, they treat them well, they give them good and meaningful work. And so we wanted to make sure that we could refract each of those different models so that we could recognize, for example, the places that offered that career stability I just described and distinguish them from places that might be a career launch pad. Those are companies that themselves don't have lots of opportunity to climb, but people go, get invested with skills, and ultimately leave to go on to better work. It's just two of the kinds of archetypes of mobility that we saw. Now, Harry talked before about one equilibrium wage. And I think one of the things which we found when we put all this together was not just that we could see there was a lot more good practice out there than we thought. But we also found that there was huge differences in terms of the lived experience of workers who were in top quintile companies versus bottom quintile companies. So companies that were in the top quintiles of access were 4 times more likely to hire people without work experience. They were a quarter more likely to hire people without degrees. And the pay was one, again, speaking of equilibrium wage, and Harry spoke about how it's a fallacy. Boy, is it ever. What we saw across a whole broad array of occupations is that the difference between top quintile companies, how much you make at a top quintile company, how much you make at a bottom quintile company, was 2.5-fold. So take the example of an admin. An admin at a top quintile company makes $82,000 a year. An admin in a bottom quintile company makes an average of $34,000 a year. Think about, just put that together and you see over a 30-year career, that's a $1.5 million difference. Mobility, same kinds of things, right? You get each promotion a year faster. You're 3 times more likely to advance within the company. You're 60% more likely to leave and go on to a better job. I'll just wrap with this and keen to turn over to Molly in a minute. One of the things that we also wanted to do was look at, and this comes from some subsequent work that Joe and I did, looking at the bottom quintiles. who wasn't, where were workers getting most likely to get stuck? One of the things that was most surprising to us was that a lot of the companies where workers were most likely to get stuck, the companies that were underperforming in delivering for their workers, had a lot of really good ingredients. These are companies where there were elements of the worker experience that were actually top quintile. And yet they put it together and somehow were failing. And so here again, it helped us to refract different models of underperformance. Tolstoy, it turns out, was wrong when he said that unhappy families are all unhappy in their own unique way. Turns out that there were actual patterns of unhappiness, so to speak. So think about a company which we call fast and flimsy. These are workers, places that actually are very good at promoting workers. If you're at a retailer, for example, and you haven't cursed out your boss and you're still there 8 months in, you're probably at least a key holder. But they aren't necessarily investing people with the training to keep rising, and ultimately people sort of crash and burn. We also found examples of significant disparities across the workforce. Companies which work essentially like caste systems, where professional workers are advancing, non-professionals wind up stuck. Companies that we call caveat emptor, because there's some talent groups, some roles where you have good prospects for mobility, others where you don't, and how's a worker supposed to know which is which? We looked at lots of places where there was a discord between the brand of the company. Companies were, top brands of the world kind of thing, and very logical for a worker to say, wow, that's going to be a great place to work. Not so much. And so what we learned from that is that, first of all, it matters how you measure this. We all know that which gets measured gets managed. But I think part of the problem we see here is that there haven't been good metrics for worker experience. And where they are, they're not embedded in the culture of decision-making within the company. Second, as we looked at companies that are doing well and companies that are not, we found a difference in terms of the level of investment that they're making, not in compliance training, not in systems training, but in productivity training. In the idea that I can help people to become more productive for me and in the process to become worth more for themselves. And that's a difference in mindset. It's hard to look at your existing workers and say, this person who's working as a clerk in Treasury could be my cyber analyst in a few years. And finally, we said it really makes a big difference in terms of what assumptions you make. Harry talked before about the different models of the business models that companies choose. And I'll give you an example. If you look at insurance companies, there were 4 insurance companies in the top quintile, 5 insurance companies in the bottom quintile. So in any industry, there's choices that companies can make, and the ability to come out what makes most sense for your business and for your workers is being able to question those assumptions. I think I've talked about a lot of these findings. I'm very keen to turn over to Molly, and I think I'll pass over there.
Great, thanks, Matt. Well, I was so excited when this new body of work came out. I read it with great interest then and was excited to have the chance to talk about it today. Signature Matt and his colleagues at Burning Glass asking a very compelling question and finding creative ways of having the data provide new insights that those of us asking those questions might not have been able to glean without finding that sort of worker and company-specific data. I find the question that's been posed on this panel and through this great body of work really compelling, and it fits into a broader conversation that I've been part of with many of you in this room around these questions of, are employers, particularly the really iconic corporate employers, are they providing good jobs for their workers? And I see over here is Maureen Conway from the Aspen Institute. Maureen has been one of the architects of this movement with so many people signing on, defining the North Star of what is a good job. And that's been a huge amount of work with a lot of us contributing to this question of what is a good job? And then there's a whole analytical exercise that my colleagues and I have been part of in measuring whether companies are providing those good jobs. But this question today is a slightly different question, which is, are employers providing pathways to those good jobs? Is there mobility up within companies or via these launch pads? And I find that very compelling, and in part because I started my career, my first job ever was a grocery cashier at Wegmans supermarket, which I will argue is the greatest supermarket in the history of supermarkets. My impression as a 16-year-old, I don't know if this is at all borne out in data, is that Wegmans was the kind of place you could start entry level, and there were good jobs in those grocery stores. You could rise up to be the head of the cheese department or the dairy department. And we always heard that the head of the cheese department was flown to France to taste cheese. I have no idea if that's true or not. But there was this perception of you can start at the bottom like I did, and if you wanted to, you could work your way up in these companies and get to a solid middle-class job and maybe even a little bit better. And I think that's really what we want to think is happening in our economy. That's very much the American spirit. And I think when we don't ask these questions of mobility, which I am guilty of in some of my work, we can take a static picture of what the wages are at a company. And some of that actually might look fairly good. Take Amazon, for instance. Amazon has a pretty high starting wage for the industry, but yet there's almost no mobility up. If you look at the distribution of wages in a company like Amazon, I always say it looks a little bit like a middle finger. Everything is just one bar up around the starting wage. There's really very high turnover and very little opportunity to start in a job, even one that has a relatively decent starting wage. There's really not much mobility up. And then, of course, there's a bigger question in these industries that Matt in his research, what I was most compelled by was looking at the industries we don't think of as having either decent paying jobs or mobility. That's the areas I focus on. So in retail, in fast food, in hospitality, some of these lower paying sectors where Harry so eloquently was talking about a low road model, that's what we think of dominating these sectors. So I came with great interest to understand whether or not in some of these iconic employers in these what we think of as low road, low paying, high turnover industries, is there movement up into good jobs? And I think that Matt's work really did shed light on it, but I have a little bit of a quibble. I think there's a need to intersect this conversation. I'm again pointing to Maureen because I think she's done such a great job of helping us set the North Star of the end goal. Where are we trying to, what level are we trying to get to? What we would agree we've got to a good job, and this question of mobility up. And some of what I found in Matt's work when we looked at the sectors where we don't expect to see decent paying jobs and mobility, there was a lot of sort of singling out employers looking like there was a lot of mobility, but not necessarily mobility to decent paying jobs. So there might be mobility up, but I think there's a really important question is, but are we reaching where we need to reach? So for instance, in some of the media coverage of Matt's report, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, they singled out Dollar General as doing particularly well on being an employer where, low barriers to entry and a lot of mobility up. People might move, get promoted several times. But if you look at the pay data for Dollar General has some of the lowest wages in the entire industry. They typically start right at the minimum wage, $7, $8 an hour. And after 3 promotions, you still might not even get to 15. So there is, in my mind, that raises a question. Are you better off starting in this terribly low-paying job and moving up to slightly less low-paying jobs, even if there's mobility? If you're not ending in what we would reasonably define as a decent job, you might not be any better off moving up from very bad-paying job to slightly less bad-paying job than just starting at an employer that pays a better wage. So I think there's a need to really ask big questions of combining this very interesting conversation about opportunity, mobility. What is it that employers can do to make sure workers, even if they're starting at the entry level, have these pathways up? But we have to keep in mind the North Star. We don't want to give too much credit for business models where there might be advancement up, but we're still so far from anywhere near a standard where the employee at the end, even after many raises, many promotions, more responsibility, it would be easy from the outside to say this is still this is not a high quality job. So that would be sort of where I would hope the conversation goes, is marrying this question of opportunity with a level standard. And I think the other question that was asked is not just are employers providing mobility, but can they? And I think Matt's research confirms a lot of our data that my team at Brookings has identified, which echoes what Harry was mentioning with Zainab Tan, is there are employers, and even in these low-wage industries, that are not only providing what we would consider good jobs, decent paying jobs, and advancement. And I think Costco, of course, is the greatest example. If we think of a lot of employers being somewhat of a middle finger, where everyone starts at the starting wage and there's not much advancement, or a hand where everyone is on the lower end and moving up, but you don't get anything near a decent paying wage, Costco's the opposite. The starting wage is, I think, $17 an hour, but the average wage is closer to 24, and the tenure is extremely long. So workers stay and they move up. So they start at a reasonable wage, and there's upward mobility. And to this question of, is that in the interest of the corporation, I think Costco is a great example of that low turnover model is one that's very good for their bottom line. So I think this question of can employers do this? The answer is, of course, yes. There's plenty of examples that they are. Are they doing that? I think if I combine the really interesting insights from Matt's fantastic work with some of the research my colleagues and I in Brookings have done, asking more of a static question of, are the biggest iconic employers in retail, hospitality, leisure? We looked at about 24 of the biggest companies that employ about 7 million frontline workers. And we asked questions during the pandemic of, what's the typical worker earning? What is a median wage? What is an average wage? And if a company doesn't, at least at the median, if at least half of their workers do not earn a decent wage, and we might debate on this stage what a decent wage is. It could be family sustaining wage, a living wage. We did something around $17 an hour at the time, which was a living wage. If these employers are not at least providing your typical worker, half your workers, that wage, it's hard to imagine that this is an employer who's offering good jobs. So I think it's just combining these two discussions of upward mobility, but also combined with some kind of North Star about a quality job, I think is such a compelling conversation, and one that I'm really proud to be part of.
Well, I would like to begin by expressing my enthusiastic agreement about the quality of Wegmans. I've never worked at Wegmans, which is probably a good thing for my waistline. But we just got one here a few years ago, and that was a big advancement. I see a lot of heads nodding, so you're all people of good taste. Harry said one of the advantages of going first is that you can say whatever you want, and one of the disadvantages of going last is that you end up repeating a lot of what has already been said. I'm going to attempt to avoid doing that by trying to round out this picture and stress areas of potential disagreement rather than spending the whole time agreeing with my colleagues here on the panel, because I do agree with most of what has been said. I am very happy that AEI and Brookings were able to come together and co-sponsor this event. I've benefited from many partnerships with Brookings, and I think when our two institutions join forces, that should be a sign that what we're talking about is something that's very important and perhaps even urgent. And I would like to just compliment Matt and the Burning Glass Institute in partnership with HBS and the Schultz Family Foundation for this really important work. One of the big components of this debate that has been lacking is evidence and data and facts to draw on, and we now have more empirical information than we did before, which I think is important. So let me make a few perhaps somewhat disconnected points just in an effort to again keep the conversation going. I think the situation in the low-wage labor market is not as dire as you might think from this discussion so far. These are some findings from a recent paper I wrote with Jeffrey Clemens, an economist at the University of California, San Diego. We look at workers over the period of 1 year, and we say, okay, where are workers when the year began? Where are workers when the year ended? About 79% of workers got raises in states that increased minimum wages in any year. So 4 out of 5 workers got a raise. Maybe a lot of that is due to the minimum wage. So we looked at low-wage workers in states that did not increase minimum wages, and there it's about 70%. So the common experience is for minimum wage workers to get a raise out of the minimum wage within 1 year of employment, provided they stay employed for that year. Your expectation should be that if you get hired at the minimum wage and you stay employed, you're going to get a raise above the wage at which you were hired. For workers who switch occupations and industries, wage gains are 6 times as large as the gains from minimum wage increases. So what we think of as upward mobility, changing occupations, changing industries, generates wage gains that are far in excess of minimum wage increases. We find that minimum wage increases accounted for roughly 19% of wage gains in years that increases went into effect. So the minimum wage is very important in the low wage labor market, but the biggest wage gains come from upward mobility. And we see a lot of mobility out of minimum wage jobs, or I should say, we see a lot of mobility out of minimum wage wages among workers who are able to keep their job for that year. In terms of upward mobility in general, the situation is kind of similar. If you think about upward mobility as a situation in which someone today has a higher household income than his or her parents had when the parents were roughly the same age. So I'm 40 years old. What was the household income in the household in which I was raised when my parents were 40 years old? Is my income higher or lower, adjusted for inflation and all that sort of stuff? Most people have a higher household income than their parents. Upward mobility is the norm, and that's especially true among people who were raised in low-income households. And so we definitely have a problem with low wages in the low-wage labor market, and we should very much be trying to think of ways to increase wages. We don't have enough upward mobility in America, and we should be thinking about ways to increase upward mobility in America, but it's not midnight in America. Maybe it's 6 or 7 o'clock. Another observation I had when listening to the panel is there was a lot of talk about businesses and what businesses can do and what businesses aren't doing, what businesses should be doing. There wasn't as much discussion about workers. And something that's happened in recent decades, one of the most notable things that's happened in the labor market in recent decades, is that the strength of the relationship between workers and firms has weakened. And a big part of that is due to firms weakening their attachment to their workers, providing lower wages, providing less training, perhaps providing less opportunities for upward wage mobility, lower raises, and generally by not being as, quote unquote, good of an employer or an employer that is as good to workers as they used to be. A lot of it is also driven by the behavior of workers. It has been driven by workers weakening their attachment to employers. It has been driven by workers increasing the pace at which they leave jobs, and you can see it in social expectations. The idea that you graduate high school and go work for an employer, and 30 years later get a gold watch on your way out the door was a common expectation a couple of generations ago. It is no longer a common expectation. Now people expect to have lots of employers over the course of their careers. And so, a business listening to this conversation might say, well, this is all well and good, and sure, if I diverted a whole bunch of money into training programs, I probably would have more productive workers, but why would I divert a whole bunch of money into training programs so that the workers who get that training then quit a month after the training program ends and go work somewhere else? And that's a very serious concern. It's a legitimate concern, and it's a concern that I think should inform discussions of both business policy and public policy in this space. Another observation, I think, is that the tenor of this debate in the public square, I think, can veer into unhelpful territory. That hasn't happened on this stage, and that's, of course, no surprise given the quality of the panelists to my left. To my left on the stage. But it is quite common to hear discussions where phrases like dead-end jobs are used, where there's discussion about how the jobs that are held by millions and millions of Americans are somehow beneath the dignity of the people who hold those jobs. And I understand the motivation behind those kinds of comments, but I would suggest that type of rhetoric is not helpful. The message that I think public policy and public leaders and opinion leaders should be sending is that work is inherently dignified, that work is an inherent source of dignity, that work is an inherent way that the social contributions from work are inherent and embedded in all the work that gets done, or at least the vast majority of work that gets done in the United States. And that when you get up in the morning and report to the fast food restaurant to flip burgers, you're doing something valuable. And you are making a contribution to your employer, and you're making a contribution to broader society. And that if you do a good job at that, then your next stop is to work behind the cash register, and then your next stop is to be the assistant manager, and then maybe your next stop is to go into an entirely new industry at a much higher wage. One of the things we've seen in the pandemic is that kind of mobility is possible. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that in the last few years, that kind of mobility has been commonplace and has been noted on the front page of newspapers. And so dead-end jobs beneath the dignity of the people who hold them, I think encourage people to stay on the sidelines and encourage people not to put their foot on the first rung of the ladder. And that's not, I think, what we want to do. Let me just underline a couple things that Harry said that I strongly agree with. I think that we have hit an equilibrium in the low-wage labor market that is characterized by low wages, that is characterized by high turnover, that is characterized by very little investment in workers on the part of companies. And I think that there are reasons to be quite concerned about that equilibrium. And there's a role here, I think, for public policy to attempt to address that. There is a tension. I think we know that changing jobs is a way to advance in your career. We know that the wages of job changers tend to be higher than the wages of job stayers, and that's because leaving a job is a way to climb the ladder in the labor market. When we're trying to diagnose the labor market as a whole in a macroeconomic context, we consider a rising quits rate an indication of worker confidence, an indication of labor market strength, and an indication of tight labor markets, I think for good reason. And so there's an optimal force with which to nudge workers to stay at firms. We don't want workers to never leave their first employer, but I think that I share Harry's judgment that that balance has gotten out of whack. And if you believe that there are positive externalities from a better trained, more productive workforce, which I certainly do, then there's a classic case for government intervention in order to encourage investment in workers. I think that there's also, and this is something Harry mentioned, but is a point that doesn't get made often enough. I think there is also a business policy case in addition to the public policy case. It's all well and good to encourage social responsibility, and we've seen, a lot of that, with ESG and CSR and all that stuff. I think it's ultimately unrealistic and a misunderstanding of how most businesses work to think that happy, warm feelings toward their employees are going to lead to major changes in business policy. But I think that businesses really might find that the return on investment in worker training is positive. They might find that they more than make up the dollars they spend on training in terms of higher revenue and higher profits, precisely because the training will lead their workers to be more productive and to have more loyalty to the business. Some companies have started doing this, and this brings us back to the great work that Matt has done in partnership with HBS and the Schultz Family Foundation. Let's see. Let's see what the data show. Certainly, I think some of the early indications are that the companies that have tried to take this high road are seeing that it makes sense not just for their workers but also for their bottom line. But we're still very early in that process, and I think the jury is very much still out, and we need more research.
Mike. So I want to pick up there and try to connect that last idea to several of the other ideas that were mentioned here, which is Harry described this as an information problem, or it could be an information problem, that employers just don't understand the potential benefit to them of taking high road policies or investing in training. And now, if I'm talking about the manager at the local dollar store, that's probably true, but that doesn't necessarily apply to the executives at dollar store. They're not unaware of this data. I'm making that assumption, but they're more aware of this data that suggests that it's actually in their own interests to do these kinds of things. So if they are more aware, and if they aren't, somebody knows otherwise, let me know. But if they are more aware, doesn't that suggest that there is kind of something that goes beyond information into culture and the way that we think about work and economic activity more broadly that would underlie that? So you're nodding, so I'm going to let you answer that first.
Well, I think the dividing line between what you're calling information and culture, but a certain outlook, a certain set of assumptions, those may not be that different. And if employers are making this assumption that this is the only thing people can do, it could be a failure of imagination. This is how I've seen workplaces set up in my industry my whole life, the last 40 years, and I don't know a way of doing it differently. But it does raise an interesting set of questions, I think. I mean, first of all, Matt's work is great, and it's really, really interesting. But it's the biggest 250 companies in the country, right, which may not be broadly representative of small to medium-sized companies, places that may not even have an HR department at all. They might have a general manager or an HR department that's not that good. It used to be true, by the way, that in America that big firms paid everybody better. It was great to be a night watchman at GM because even the night watchman earned a pay premium. That's much less true now. And I do think employers, what you hear all the time is about the competition for talent, right? That's a big word that you hear a lot. But I think employers spend a lot more time thinking about talent among their professional and managerial employees. Certainly college educated, even fairly high in that group, rather than their lower to medium end employees.
Because those are the people they encounter Those people,
Well,
they're
but,
with every day.
maybe you call that sort of a cultural outlook. They're used to thinking that low-end folks can do nothing but flip burgers or whatever the equivalent of that is. Whereas it's at the higher levels that people are more creative and that talent, certainly in a company that relies on innovation, the tech companies. So I just wonder if that's. And by the way, even in companies that do have HR departments that are a little bigger, what I've always heard is that the HR folks who may be more oriented towards thinking like this have a hard time influencing the CEOs that this stuff matters, right? That it's not just the capital market and marketing and finance. So there's a lot of, companies are very heterogeneous. There could be lots of reasons at a lot of different companies why they're stuck in a certain mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for myself, I keep thinking, is this just an adversarial problem that characterizes relationships between employers and workers? Matt, do you want to?
I think there's part of that is not even necessarily a lack of belief as a lack of visibility. I think there's actually a different kind of information challenge, which is less about, Brent, to your question, there's all this evidence base that says that some of these policies pay off, why can't people apply them? Part of being able to apply them means being able to see the workers within your organization. Most companies, big or small, haven't the faintest clue who works for them. They know your tax ID number. They used to know where you sit. They don't even necessarily know that now. But they don't know what sorts of capabilities that you bring with you. And if you don't have that kind of information, then you can't be effective at leveraging the talent base you have. Mike asked a great question at the end, which is, where he made the point that job changers tend to do better than those who stay in their jobs. And I'd ask why. And I'd say a big part of it is the failure of imagination that Harry described, that I can't, as an employer, it's very hard for me to look at people who are doing a job and imagine them doing a different job. And so the only way that people have of promoting themselves in too many organizations is promoting themselves out versus promoting themselves up. So as long as that lack of understanding, that lack of transparency of the workforce I have and how it can be the workforce I need continues to persist, there isn't the possibility of implementing the wonderful textbook sort of things that I read about in HBR about how I ought to manage my workforce.
Can I just this one thing just really quickly?
Sure.
A guy named David Weil talks a lot about what's called the fissured workplace. You might be under one roof, but actually different. You contracted out the HR functions. Actually, you don't work for GM anymore. If you work in their cafeteria, you might work for Sodexo rather. In that world, it's not even your employee. It's Sodexo that manages. I'm just taking them as one company. They might be a fine company, and we don't even know if the fissuring thing in America is this big or this big. But certain trends reinforce that problem that you just described.
Molly.
Another issue I would say matters to this conversation about, even if we believe that this is in the business's ultimate interest, why isn't it happening more? My colleague, Katie Bach, who is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, she was an executive at Starbucks, was the managing director of the Good Jobs Institute, and spent years talking to C-suites about this very question. Can we invest in, change the operating model so that workers can be better trained, more productive, increase wages? And when we did our big report last year, we asked this question, well, why aren't more of these big employers paying decent wages? And we asked some of the big structural questions, and where we landed was the incentives that companies face are not aligned to making these investments, in part because shareholders and the C-suite is really thinking about quarterly returns, and that's the incentives. This is what investors are focused on, and some of these investments take some time to pay off. And we listened to almost 2 years of earnings calls for all of the 24 companies to just get a better sense of what questions investors were asking, particularly around anything to do with wages. So we made sure every single time there was an investor question, and this was in the height of the pandemic when workers were risking their lives to go to a McDonald's or to be in a grocery store. So a lot of extra sympathy for the plight of workers. And in almost every case, the way that the investors framed any decision to offer hazard pay or invest in training or increase wages was out of skepticism, almost like, do you really need to do that? This is really a cost to be minimized, and prove to me this is really something that has to be done. And in fact, when Walmart years ago raised its starting wage, their stock price crashed like 10 percentage points. It regained in not that long. But I think that is the sort of constraint that a lot of even very well-intentioned corporate leaders face, is really the incentives are often to minimize costs. That's the perception, is these are costs, they're not investments. And they're really being held accountable to these short-term returns. And so part of what we get at in our paper is that some of that has to change, because there's really, even for these very well-intentioned leaders, sometimes there isn't this space because of all these incentives. And there's provocative things, like could you imagine having members of the board who have come from worker groups or have more worker representation? Or is there different ways we can think about having more of a long-term runway for some of these decisions?
So Mike, I'd really like to hear you respond to that.
I'm unclear as to what that refers to. There was quite a bit.
Yeah, there's quite a bit there. So the idea that the incentive structures for businesses drive them away from doing making the kinds of investments in their own workforce that potentially raise skill levels and income and so on.
I think that's undoubtedly true. And a lot of that has to do with the time horizon on which businesses make decisions. I think Harry's also right that a lot of it really does have to do with a lack of imagination. I don't think it's any coincidence that some of the most imaginative CEOs are the ones that are taking steps in this direction. It's a risk. It might not work out, but in their judgment, it's a risk that's worth taking.
Can you connect it though to the idea of why should I train an employee who's probably going to leave?
Sure. Well,
what do we do about that phenomenon?
Yeah. One answer to that question is that ultimately, even if that employee does leave, that a better trained, more productive workforce will benefit my business in and of itself. And so, reconceiving this model where I need to invest in training, that I need the workers to stay, and that's how I capture the benefit. Maybe you invest in workers, and then if enough other companies also invest in workers, that even if those workers leave, you're still capturing some benefit. That could be completely wrong, but it's at least a plausible hypothesis that I think is worth exploring. Another kind of classic answer from the economics literature is that you'll increase the productivity of the workers that you're investing in, and you'll decrease the likelihood that they want to leave. And that hypothesis, I think, has a very strong evidence base behind it. If you say, I'll pay your community college tuition, or I'll pay half your community college tuition, and I'll give you health insurance benefits, and if you stay here, you could expect a series of raises, and we'll be nice to you and make you feel like a member of the community. That is attractive, and I've done some research on this. Lots of economists have done research that really show that employees value non-wage amenities, and I think you can think about those things as investments. You could also think about them as non-wage amenities, and I think both are relevant and both matter. So those are two of many answers to your question.
I think Harry's got a comment here.
I agree with that. I think that when employers make that decision to pay people more and to train them, they will make the assumption that those people will be less likely to leave. At the same time, they don't want to invest in everybody. because they really don't think that some people are going to stick around. And I remember a conversation a number of years ago with a VP, I think from UPS, and he said, and he was talking about places that are often not in major metro areas, but in smaller towns and rural areas. He said, I'm not going to invest in someone who can't pass a drug test. And in a tight labor market, a lot of people who walk through the door, especially those who don't have some college, can't pass a drug test. Now, this is one person talking, but it does illustrate the mindset that, yes, paying people more, training them makes them less likely to leave, but they have to show me the ability that they can do well with the training and stick around before I'm willing to make that. So I do think there's it goes both ways, and they want to see it. And like I said, some of these companies will raise the bar at the front end to make sure that these workers are trainable.
I want to give Matt and Molly a chance to get in, and then we're going to go to audience questions.
Mike, I'll start with just one small quibble, and that's just on vocabulary around non-work amenities. I mean, literally it's true, right? We can look at the kind of training and benefits that are being offered and say, okay, these are things that we're providing other than just the wage itself that people value. The problem with framing it in that way, and I think you're right, that is, by the way, for a lot of employers, how they think about those kinds of investments in training. Well, as long as you're learning, you're likely to stick around. And so they measure the outcomes of their investments in L&D, what's called learning and development, as employee engagement and employee retention. The problem is that those really aren't thinking about investments in my workforce as exactly that, as investments in the workforce, and in people's ability to become more productive, more valuable over time. And so as long as we're sort of stuck in a place of saying, okay, training is about keeping people, as opposed to training is about advancing people and making our human capital stock worth more, then we make suboptimal choices about what training we offer, about the level of transparency that we provide to people for where that training is, about the level of direction that we provide. We talked about visibility of employers to workers, but there's also a visibility challenge for workers to understand the opportunities for mobility within their company. And the companies, when we profiled the companies who are doing well, we found that companies that are serious about thinking about their workers as not only a present asset, but a future asset, signpost, here's where we're going to need talent, here's what you could step into, here's how you could get there.
Yeah, I think on this question of imagination, one more comment I would make is this, again, I learned from my colleague Katie Bach, who spent some time at the Good Jobs Institute speaking with C-suites about these questions of how do you improve jobs for workers earning low wages. And one of the exercises they did was to present to the C-suite an analysis of their workers' wages and comparing it to a living wage. And I understand teaching, this idea that you may be paying a market wage, which is, I think, the typical instinct. We pay what the market clears. We pay enough to get people through the door. Well, often in these very low-wage jobs, that's nowhere near enough for a worker to just pay the basic bills. And when you run through that, I mean, we're talking in sort of terms about low wages and minimum wages. I mean, the 10th percentile, I just looked this up, because there's some new research that came from David Otter and Aaron Dubé that shows during the pandemic, really the only real wage gain has been at the very bottom of the income spectrum. So I was looking up, there's been a 6% real wage gain for the bottom 10th percentile. Does anyone want to wager a guess how much a person working in the bottom 10th percentile makes? It's like $11.70 an hour. That's terribly low. You cannot pay your bills on $11.70 an hour. So I think there's a failure of understanding of what these low wages actually mean in the lives of workers, and that sometimes there's a gap there in just understanding. When we say low wages, well, what does that actually look like in terms of a person's ability to just meet the basics? So that would be my point as well, is that I think in the same way that I think Matt's data has been very illuminating, I think sometimes a look inwards to say, how do these wages actually, what does that look like from a balance sheet of your household? Like, could you pay rent and buy food and do your basics, keep the lights on? And the answer for a lot of these jobs is no. You can't come anywhere close to that. So that's also, I think, a failure of imagination.
Excellent point. Okay, we've got mics that are going to be rotating here. Please, when you ask your question, tell us your name, tell us your affiliation, and then ask a question rather than make a statement. All right. So let's start right over here, right next where you are.
Carl Polzer. I work on a project that advocates for the bottom 50%, and I worked for the nursing home industry as a policy analyst for many years. Lots of low-wage workers there. So my question is two things: how public policy can help workers help themselves. One is non-compete clauses. If one of the ways they can have leverage to get ahead, to break down these barriers. Okay. And the second thing is just kind of where Molly was going there. A good job for a low-wage worker is often one where they can just pay their bills. You know, and there's a mathematical problem with employers dealing with this for promotion. It's just that there aren't that many jobs at the top. A lot of these low-wage workers require 20 people at the bottom, and it's like advancing somebody in the Army. How many jobs are there, right? There's just a limitation. So public policy for me, but anyhow, what can public policy do?
So, yeah, okay. I think somewhere in there might have been a question if anybody wants to reply.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Actually, one of the new topics I'm doing work on is care workers as a particular segment in the low-wage workforce, because the reality is we cannot improve the jobs and the pay of this very essential but terribly underpaid workforce without public investment. So I think the wages for personal care aides and home health aides are set low by Medicaid reimbursement rates and the lack of public investment in those sectors. So it's a side project of mine is I really would like to see more public investment in the care sector to allow those wages and the quality and the training in those jobs to go up. In our report that we look at this question of low-wage workers, we have a whole section on policy reforms, because ultimately my personal view is that the incentives are so misaligned for corporations, even with the evidence that it's good for the bottom line. I think there's just too many incentives in the way, stopping corporations from really investing in workers and raising wages. So we put forth things like raising the minimum wage, which Harry referenced. I would be in the camp that thinks $15 is absolutely spot on, but that's probably not shared with everybody. And also, I'm a big believer in unions and worker power, that when workers have more leverage and more power, they can actually push for higher wages and have more ability to balance this lopsided corporations having lots of power and workers not having power. We have seen through the last several decades, the erosion of unions has coincided with the real erosion of wages. So we put forth labor law reform to make it easier for workers to organize, and some corporate governance reforms as well to help with these sort of short-term incentive issues. But those would be three, and then I would put in there as well non-competes, as you mentioned, as well as I think in some of these very low-wage sectors, public investment is needed to make those jobs better jobs. It's not just about raising the minimum wage. If there's no money to pay personal care aides because Medicaid is not reimbursing them, you're not going to get very far. So I think there's also a question of like public resources as well.
I'll just say very quickly, a couple of things. My colleague, Krista Ruffini, just published a paper showing how, I think in places with higher minimum wages, not necessarily 15,
Yeah.
but
fair.
that it
disagree.
actually improves the health of patients quite considerably. So that's some evidence that this can really improve outcomes. And I completely agree that public policy has an important role to play here. I'm going to argue that I don't know, employers, especially in a competitive industry, how much responsibility it is from the employer to pay out of a social justice, my workers need higher pay. That's right. And the whole living wage thing, if you're in a household with multiple workers, the whole framing, I think, of the living wage thing, but I'm not sure that we can count on that being a major motivator. Sometimes it helps, sometimes not. And by the way, I agree with the thing on worker power and worker voice. I think that matters. But in a world where unions have been declining in the private sector since about 1955, that's a really long, I just can't, 6% of the private sector, I just can't be optimistic. So maybe we need to look for other ways to enhance voice, and worker power.
Okay, other questions? We're going to go back here to this gentleman in the hat. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Yaya Kamusi with the United States of Africa 17 Project Task Force. I listen to you guys. How familiar are you with organizational analysis and performance evaluation. Second, your conceptual analysis is a little bit fuzzy to me. And third, where in what you're doing is ideology driven rather than what you're trying to do?
I am not sure. Maybe we can, maybe do that, let's do this after, if that's okay. Yeah. Other question, yeah, right here. We're gonna here and then over to there.
Hi, my name is Joe. I'm from the George Washington Institute of Public Policy. My question is, how do public benefits bear on this conversation, and how can companies think about and incorporate public benefits that they know their low-wage workers are going to be taking advantage of? How can they kind of adapt and create programs to incorporate that into their strategy for workforce?
Anybody want to
I
take
think
that
there's
one?
a question here not only about what public benefits exist today, but what public benefits can solve some of the free rider problem that Mike was describing before, this kind of obsession that we tend to have with, well, what happens if I train somebody and they leave? And so I think if you look at countries like Singapore and the like, we've evolved sophisticated lifelong learning infrastructures. Essentially the ability for workers, first of all, to control their own training, for employers to contribute that. We have those tax structures today, but they aren't popularized, aren't invested. And I think that ability to make sure that people can, that employers can make investments in people, that people can, in tax-advantaged ways, that people can control the kind of learning that they can invest in themselves, is an infrastructure that is underdeveloped right now.
Next question. And I think this is maybe our last, maybe we can get one more in after this.
I'm running for school board in Fairfax County on a math and science platform, so to speak. I came up with the idea of total factor productivity bonds that would let the bond market invest in partnerships that would raise total factor productivity in the long run and thus reduce default rates on bonds, but by raising wages and productivity. And they would invest in things like partnerships between universities and local schools to have continuing education in math and science. In more conservative areas, they might invest in new mechanism design for voucher systems, which a lot of research shows have not worked very well. What do you think about that sort of idea, and do you think it could progress?
Anyone have a thought? Not
Only-
something I'm familiar with.
The only question I'd ask, and likewise, I don't have huge familiarity when, learning more, but I think there's a question when we try to solve things at too broad an ecosystem level of who has agency. And one of the things I think is important here of making sure that workers have agency for themselves, that employers recognize the agency they have for the mobility of their workers. And so I think there are broad societal investments that we need to make, and there may be good structures out there for doing that. But I would want to make sure we're not doing so in a way that takes away from the perception that both employers and workers have that they can have agency for progress.
We've got a question in the corner. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm Maureen Conway. I'm with the Aspen Institute, and thank you for the shout out on our Good Jobs work. And I have two questions. So in our Good Jobs work, we think of good jobs as being driven by economic stability, economic mobility, and equity, dignity, and voice. And we don't see those three pillars as sort of like trade-offs. So I appreciate, Matt, your sort of call out about some do one, some do another, right? Like you really want to see them work together because they intersect with each other. And on the economic mobility front, we see in particular economic stability being a real necessity for people to be able to pursue stability. So my question is kind of what can we understand? We have so much data on wages, but we don't sort of have other factors that influence economic stability, or we don't look at them as much. One of the drivers of instability is not just the wage level, but sort of hours, sufficiency, predictability of hours, those kinds of things, but also the benefits, et cetera. What I have seen with training programs is that people who don't have basic economic stability really struggle to pursue economic mobility. And if you look in a company, so, there's the story of Doug McMillan starting at the bottom of Walmart and rising up, right? But he had parents, like Molly probably had parents, who provided his economic stability while he was in that entry-level job. For people who don't, so how do we get insight into this? So this is really a question for you, Matt, in terms of what you were able to see in terms of who rises and who doesn't within companies, and what do we know about sort of their broader economic stability? So that's one question. My other question is just in terms of how we think about productivity being driven by training rather than job design, because I think to think about how we build productivity, we have to think not only about the skills within individual workers, but how their work is structured for them to build skills. I think we think too narrowly about how people build skills. So can we broaden our conversation on that? That's my question.
Go ahead, Matt.
So let me start with this question of what we know about who rises. So first of all, you raised some really important questions, Maureen, about some of the kinds of structures that can provide people both with that stability and with the upward mobility, and frankly with the dignity and voice that you described as well. Our intent in developing the American Opportunity Index, first and foremost, was to create a yardstick. And so, again, one of the things we wanted to make sure of is we look at some of those questions of structures as being incredibly relevant, incredibly important, but things that we wanted to be able to have an outcomes-based measurement of real worker experience that could help us evaluate which structures seem to matter the most. Ultimately, I would want to be able to suggest to an employer, here's the kind of investments that you can make in your workforce that will have the outsized impact, both in terms of the productivity of your workforce and in terms of your workers' lives. And so this is a first step toward that. In terms of your question, the specific question of who rises and who doesn't, in fact, actually, as we're deep in the midst of building the 2023 American Opportunity Index, and a lot of what we're doing right now is tracking specific differences and disparities around workforces, disparities based on race, ethnicity, and gender, based on levels of education attainment, and so forth, precisely to give us greater insight into that question.
And on your second question, Maureen, I agree with you that job design training was one, and that gets to the whole Zeynep tone that a good job strategy has to be a broader concept. But people talk about in retail and leisure hospitality, those jobs don't have to be just take the food from here. That you can imagine workers having more responsibility and rewarding them for that. So I think your point gets to the imagination issue and the failure of imagination, but I think your point is broadly correct.
Well, great big thanks to all the panelists for really insightful presentations on this topic. And I'm personally looking forward to learning a lot more about all of your research in this area. I want to thank the audience for its attention and great questions. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue with you as well about how to improve economic opportunity for all Americans at all levels and fulfill the promises this country has for each of us. So thank you again for coming.